It's Tuesday, April 21st, 2020. We've been talking about feeling overwhelmed and how that's something that changes as we grow older. When we were very little, most of the things that overwhelmed us were the things that made us breathless as small children. Most often, we were overwhelmed by the excitement that came from being overstimulated with the fun that was going on all around us, or even the anticipation of the fun that was planned. The anticipation of a 3 months away trip to Disney World, for example, would have overwhelmed us with excitement to the point where we would promise to be good boys and girls for the rest of our lives. So as children, we were most often overwhelmed by the thought of fun and excitement. Now, I know that that's not taking into account the people whose childhood was difficult due to parents who were unattentive or absent or even abusive. But for most of us, childhood was a time when being overwhelmed had more to do with excitement and fun than anything else. When we become adults, we discover that adulting is, difficult, and we're more often overwhelmed by the pressures and stresses that surround us. We used to be overwhelmed by the idea of the fun of vacation. Now, as adults, we're overwhelmed by the idea of the cost of vacation. In other words, it's much less fun to be overwhelmed as an adult than it was to be overwhelmed as a small child. This is mostly because small children have a sense of being held. They understand that sometimes things don't go right, but they assume that mom and dad will come to their rescue. They know there's a lap to climb up on, a hand to hold, and when things get really unbearable, there are strong arms that will lift them and carry them through the mess. We tend to lose that as adults because we believe that part of being grown up is understanding that you have now become the one who carries others instead of the one who will be carried. We seem to lose our status as the snuggly as soon as we become the snuggler. As adults, we also let go of things that help us to feel safe in favor of the things that make it possible for us to be safe. In other words, we don't want to have to rely on anyone to make us feel safe. We would rather take the responsibility of making sure that our family can be safe. So we install a deadbolt and an alarm, and we buy a gun. We make that transition from wanting to feel safe to finding a way to be safe the moment we stop reaching for the hand of a parent for help to cross the street. We then get busy learning, first of all, as teenagers, to be able to cross the street alone so that we can learn to help our little brothers and sisters cross the street so that we can later become the parent who helps our own children to cross the street. And the moment we come to the place where we don't want to have to rely on anyone to make us feel safe, we lose something precious. We lose the overwhelming joy of childhood. But of even greater concern, when we get to the place where we no longer need to rely on others, we become short-sighted as adults. And by that, I don't mean the kind of short-sightedness that can be cured with glasses. I mean the kind of short-sightedness that only allows us to see the people around us for whom we have responsibility and prevents us from seeing the God of the universe who is willing to take responsibility for us, if only we'll allow it. And that's why our sense of being overwhelmed shifts. We're overwhelmed by the responsibility we have for others. But we're never overwhelmed, it seems, by the grace that God the Father shows us as He takes personal responsibility for us. I'm convinced that every one of us has to find a way to get back in touch with the love that's being offered to us, rather than exclusively focusing on the love that we owe to others. It's time that we realize that adulting is only difficult when we insist on focusing on our responsibilities as adults and ignore what it means to be loved and cared for by God. Adulting is only difficult when we insist on setting aside our inner child in favor of the grown-up we're pretending to be. And that's why during these times together, we've been on a quest to try to remember what it was like to feel like a child. I told you about my mom and her habit of rocking me on her lap in time to the music coming from the radio on song time first thing in the morning. I was only 3 years old back then, and when my mom was rocking me in her lap 60 years ago, she was loving me unconditionally. But I wouldn't have known what to call it back then. But then suddenly, it seems, we're not 3 years old anymore, and the love of our parents takes on a different quality. When I was 3, my mom tied my shoes for me. When I was 4, my mom lovingly taught me how to tie my own shoes. And when I was 5, my mom lovingly expected me to tie my shoes by myself. She did that because she knew that the business world and even the ministry world would be difficult places. And she knew that my colleagues and my competitors would probably be unwilling to tie my shoes for me when I got to work. As an old man, I can see that kind of unconditional love for a 3-year-old and that kind of unconditional love with expectations for a 5-year-old are the same kind of love. But I think we'd all have to admit that they don't feel the same. In fact, it feels like our mom and dad, who used to love us no matter what, have become people who will only really love us if we, well, you can probably finish that sentence on your own, from your own experience. So for all of us, the day comes when we think that our parents no longer really love us or understand us the way they used to. And when that happens, we turn to our friends. And most of us, if not all of us, were willing to dress and act in any way that our friends required because we were that desperate for their love and acceptance. Some of us came to the conclusion that we were never going to be good enough to be truly accepted by the cool group, so we stopped trying there and set our sights on the next most cool group and tried to figure out what we'd have to do to be accepted by them. Sometimes the peer group that we find will require us to do some truly awful things. And in our desperation, we're often willing to do whatever they require, and we're willing to do that because we are desperate. But sometimes our new peer group only requires small and simple things of those of us who want to be loved and accepted by them. Sometimes it's only a matter of what we wear and how we cut our hair, and over the years I've noticed that when it comes to fashion and haircuts, every generation has managed to come up with a way to scare their parents to death. In the 70s, when I was a teenager, the 1970s, it was always about hair length for guys and skirt length for girls. My parents had a philosophy about hair that was quite simple. The only uncool thing about hair was not getting a haircut, and they made it clear that the moment my hair grew long enough to touch my ears, it was time to go to the barber. Well, my friends had a philosophy about hair as well, and it was also quite simple. The only uncool thing about hair was getting a haircut. If your hair was short enough to see your ears, neck, collar, or even your eyes, that was not cool. And as a teenager, I was trapped because I couldn't keep my parents' hair rules, so they would accept me, and while at the same time keeping my friends' hair rule so that they would accept me. I couldn't do both. Now you may be sitting there thinking, I have no idea what he's talking about here. But I have to tell you, I seriously doubt it. Because it seems to me that this is the first sense we all develop. The moment that we begin to think that our parents don't love us the way they used to is the moment that we begin to look for friends who will love us. And the moment we begin to look for friends who will love us is the moment that we first begin to ask, what's it going to take to get my friends to love and accept me? Now, we don't go out with a clipboard so that we can start making a list of the things that we'll need to do. But that said, it doesn't take long for us to sort out what we're going to have to do to get this group to accept us. And that pursuit of acceptance carries us from one peer group to another until we finally get to college, where we try once again to discover what it's going to cost us to be accepted by each new group. Sometimes what that new peer group requires is simple and fun, but sometimes it's dark and sinister and soul damaging. But more often than not, we're willing to pay the price because we go through life desperate to be loved and accepted. Our time is up, and I'd like to encourage you once again to spend some time in prayer. Think about the things that you've been willing to do over the years for the sake of being loved and accepted by others. I'm not asking you to take a dark and perilous journey into your past because I don't want you to be overwhelmed with guilt over the things that you've been willing to do to be accepted. I'm only asking you to think these things through so that you can admit to God how far in the wrong direction you've been willing to travel for the sake of being loved. Then, as Paul does here in his prayer in Ephesians, ask God to open your eyes to help you to see how very much he loves you. Ask God to help you to see that his love is unconditional and that he attaches no requirements to his love. Spend some time in prayer now, pondering these things as you ask God to heal your short-sightedness. Let's talk again tomorrow.